The film opens with a gloomy man holding a letter in front of him. The letter was to be delivered to his brother abroad. The man then took his own life, driven by the heavy burden on his mind. Police soon arrived at the scene and secured the scene. Elsewhere, there was a man named Marco, the man's brother. After receiving the letter, Marco decided to return to Paris, where his brother had died. Marco worked as a ship captain and owned several businesses. Unfortunately, his marriage was not going well, all due to Marco's frequent travels and abandonment of his family. On the other hand, there was a woman named Raphael. She was the wife of a wealthy businessman and influential figure in Paris, named Laporte. Raphael lived in a large, luxurious apartment. One day, she saw Marco arriving in his car and renting an apartment unit, which happened to be right next door to hers. From then on, Marco began to investigate who was truly behind his brother's death. Furthermore, he also learned that his daughter had also been a victim of someone else's actions. The person in question turned out to be Laporte. Slowly, Marco began observing Raphael's daily life. Meanwhile, Laporte was often away on business, leaving Raphael often alone. Despite their comfortable life, there were emotional needs that her husband couldn't meet. Marco then visited his daughter, Justine, who was hospitalized for trauma. He tried to reassure her by telling her that everything would be fine. But another problem arose. Marco's shoe business went bankrupt, further depressing him. Although he still had assets to maintain, he still had to start from scratch. Furthermore, his relationship with his wife, Sandra, was becoming increasingly uncertain. One day, Marco saw Laporte leaving Raphael alone. He took the opportunity to approach Raphael, and they eventually shared a romantic relationship for the first time. However, Marco's actions were not aimless, but part of a premeditated plan. Marco slowly began investigating a remote location used for improper purposes. Afterward, he returned to the apartment and again approached Raphael, repeating the same intimate encounter as the day before. Several people were suspected of involvement in his brother's disappearance. That night, Marco approached them and responded one by one. The next morning, Marco and Laporte happened to be in the same elevator. Laporte's son recognized Marco as the man who had repaired his bicycle. As a token of gratitude, Marco invited him to their house for coffee. Raphael, fearing that Laporte would discover his connection to Marco, sent a message and asked him to leave. Long story short, Marco then teamed up with a detective to uncover the mastermind behind the crime that had taken his brother's life and destroyed his son's. However, Marco already knew who the perpetrator was. He was just waiting for the right moment to act. One day, Marco met a man who worked at the same location Marco had visited. The man had an important recording. Upon reviewing the recording, Marco found strong evidence implicating Laporte and his brother. Meanwhile, Raphael was about to pick up his son from school, but his teacher told him that Laporte had already picked him up. There, she saw her son's friend and said she wanted to hang out at his house. Raphael invited her back to his apartment. At home, Raphael received a letter from her husband, stating that he already knew about Raphael's relationship with Marco, and that Laporte was inviting her son to live with him and would be separating from Raphael. Raphael, thinking this was all Marco's fault, confronted him and blamed Marco for intruding into his life. Because of Marco, Raphael and Laporte's family was falling apart. This was all Marco's goal. One day, Laporte and his son returned to Raphael's apartment. Shortly after, Marco appeared and immediately attacked Laporte. However, the situation turned around when Raphael helped Laporte and killed Marco. It was eventually revealed that Laporte was the cause of Marco's brother's death and the trauma his daughter experienced. Laporte had a long-standing grudge against Marco's brother. Laporte forced Marco's brother to be intimate with his own niece, Marco's daughter. Because of this, he felt guilty and ultimately decided to leave for good. Unfortunately, this grudge was not repaid. Despite his guilt, Laporte was still free to breathe fresh air, while Marco had to follow his brother. Furthermore, Justine's trauma remained unhealed until the film ended.